Alrighty, so if you have got your Daniel's timeline, your WH chart, even if you've done your at a glance where you go chapter by chapter and tell like what each chapter is kind of about, you can pull that out. Most of the chapter divisions, of course we know there were no chapter divisions when Daniel wrote this, but a lot of times in most Bibles it'll kind of tell you like a blurb about what each chapter is going to be about. The one thing I like about this Bible is there is nothing. There's a theme and then there's a blank line, and so you actually have to go through and read it and decide for yourself what it's about in your own words. So it would be something that would make sense to you. Because what the writers, bring out, or the people who publish the Bible bring out, may not be what's important to you in that chapter. It may be something that God shows you that's totally different.
What is that?
This is the, I can't show you the front cover because it's been so crazy. It's the New Inductive Study Bible, the NASB. It's actually an inductive Bible study Bible. And it is double-spaced. So you have room to write notes, and then they leave these big wide margins for you to write in, which is, eye color. Somebody asked me one day, I was studying in Chick-fil-A, and somebody came up and asked me why I was using, thought I was either drawing a picture of them or coloring in an adult coloring book.
Oh my.
And I said, no, why don't you sit down and I'll explain what I'm actually doing. So anyway, yes. Alrighty, so we're going to just review real quick what we did in chapters 1 through 6. And then we'll move on to chapter 7 and run through an overview of 7 through 12. Because if you read 7 through 12, you probably have 1,000,001 questions. But you don't get to ask them until we actually get to study those chapters in depth. So you have to write down all your questions and you have to hang on to them for a while until we get to that chapter, because I am just that nice of a person. Alrighty, so chapter 1, who is the king of Babylon at this point? Nebuchadnezzar, good old Nebi. And who was taken, first of all, how many times did he actually go after or besiege Jerusalem? 3. He went 3. Who was taken during the first siege?
Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Yes. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were their Babylonian names. Who was taken in the second siege? Anybody remember? Yes, Ezra. Ezra was taken. Okay. And the third siege is when it was the city was completely decimated and the temple was completely destroyed. And who was left behind to be the weeping prophet? Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. And Daniel, we talked last week, Daniel and, I'm sorry, not Ezra, Ezekiel was taken during the second siege. Ezekiel and Daniel are really contemporaries, but nowhere in Scripture do we see that they ever actually met. Like they were actually, they were both in Babylon at the time. At the same time, there's only like a couple of years at the very end that they outlive one another, or one outlives them, but they're really contemporaries, and they're both prophesying for different reasons. And they both, even though they were in the same place and the prophecies were for the same people, they were prophesying about things that were very different. And we'll see a lot of what Daniel prophesied about tonight, and then when we get to Ezekiel next, we'll see Ezekiel's prophecies and how very different they actually were. So in chapter 2, we found out that it is in Nebuchadnezzar's second year of his reign. And what kind of dream did Nebuchadnezzar have?
A disturbing dream.
Right, but what was it about? It was always disturbing.
A statue.
It was about a statue. And what, just in a few words, what was that statue representative of?
5 kingdoms.
The 5 kingdoms. 4 earthly kingdoms, and then the final kingdom was whose kingdom?
God's.
God's kingdom. In chapter 3, it's who's still king?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar is still there. And what did he do?
Created a statue of himself, or the statue.
Right. Out of
Gold.
Out of gold. Who's remarkably just sort of absent in chapter 3?
Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel. Daniel's nowhere to be found in chapter 3. We have no clue where he is. We just know he's not there.
That's true, yeah.
So this is really Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's kind of chapter to shine. So we don't know how he knew these things happened. Whether he was told by his friends when he got back that this is what had gone on, whether some of the other satraps maybe, or the other wise men maybe told him, whether Nebuchadnezzar told him, whether he read it somewhere. We really don't know. But somehow God allowed him to know that this is what happened to his friends. And what did his friends refuse to do?
Bow down and worship.
Refused to bow down and worship. And so what happened to them? Where did they end up?
Fiery furnace.
In a fiery furnace. Now, I've heard, and I meant to bring a picture, that this furnace is like where they would have gone in. It was like a giant kiln that people could actually go in and do pottery and stuff. So it would have been very, very hot. A lot of people, it's not like they took him like to the kitchen and shoved him in this oven, right? So it was big. So people were naturally able to walk around in it. And there was probably a hole in the top to keep the fire going. And there would have been a door to keep it shut, and it probably was made out of stone, so that not only was the inside going to be hot, but so would the walls. You wouldn't want to go touching the walls, like to try to, beat your way out or anything, you'd get burned. So that's probably where they walked in, and the door was shut, and this fire, whether it's kept, just really, what do you call it, like smoldering, and then they raise it up, but we know that they were told to raise it 7 times. So I don't know how hot it has to be, a fire, to be able to set pottery, but I'm figuring it's probably really, really hot. And 7 times, it's not like they had a thermometer, so that's just a way of saying make it really, really, really hot. That, like we say,
it seared the king's men.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, kill them. But it's like when we say 1,000,000 times, make it 1,000,000 times hotter. So it doesn't mean that they knew what it was and they put in a thermometer, they didn't have them. But yeah, and the Most High God delivered them. They were saved, actually walked around with them. In in chapter 4, who's still king?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar. And what happened here?
Another dream.
Mm-hmm.
But he's praising the Most High God because of,
Is this where he went nuts?
yeah, he humbled himself.
He did.
God humbled himself.
Well, first,
God humbled him.
yeah, right.
Yes.
But in the beginning, Nebuchadnezzar is the one writing, because in verse 4 it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my palace before he had this dream. So Nebuchadnezzar's actually writing a lot of this, if not all of it. And so what did he dream about this time?
Humongous tree.
A big tree. And what happened to the tree? Yeah, it got felled. It fell. But what was left? The stump, a remnant. God always leaves a remnant. Always leaves a holy remnant. And so God and then Nebuchadnezzar, of course, yes, for a year, he did okay. Then he decided to start making a lot of very prideful remarks. He made one prideful remark, standing on a rooftop, and God did exactly what he said he was going to do. He humbled him completely. And the phrase that we saw there was, God rules over the realms of man, and he bestows it to whomever he chooses. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar had to learn, and had to humble himself. After that, we don't know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We know he died, but we don't know what happened to him. We know that there were 3 kings, 3 of his sons, that were very, very evil. And they only served very, very short times. And then comes up who as the king?
Belshazzar.
Belshazzar. And this is probably about 12 years after chapter 8. We're now up to probably 539 BC. And remember, as we count to Jesus, we count down. Like we're counting down to blast off Jesus, and then we start counting forward again. So we're counting down. So 539, about 12 years after chapter 8, we see his son. And we're not told a whole lot about him. We only see him in this one chapter. And what happens to him?
He gets humbled.
Well, he gets humbled in a big way, because he actually gets
killed.
He gets killed. He saw the writing on the wall, literally, and he got killed. Yeah. So the Most High God here is sovereign.
He was making a mockery out of God with drinking out of the common cup, making God common.
Right, exactly. And we talked about last week how that common, when the first commandment, or the third commandment says, do not take the Lord's name in vain, that in vain is common. We don't treat God as common. We don't treat God's name as just something that's common. like Georgia and Sue and anybody else. We don't treat
Like all
God that
mine.
way. Yeah, God is not, God's name and who God is and God's character is not common. And we don't get to treat him that way. And that's exactly what Belshazzar was doing. He was treating God like he was common. He was treating the holy relics like they were just common everyday things. And the feast that he was celebrating, he was probably also honoring his gods. So he was also using the holy relics of God to actually honor and worship his fake gods. And God also says, I'm not going to have any other God before me, or I'm not going to have any other God in my face. And so he was killed that night, that very night. And who came to rule now? Darius the Mede, and he conquered that whole kingdom. And then in chapter 6, who is still reigning? Darius. And he's reigning during the Medo-Persian Empire. King Darius, actually, when you look on your timeline, you see that there were some times when Darius and Cyrus were actually co-regents, because it was a Medo-Persian kingdom. Darius was the Mede king, and Cyrus was the Persian king. So they actually ruled some. They were actually co-regents, and we learned also that Belshazzar also had a co-regent, which is why Daniel would be the third highest, because there was already a co-regent. So, what happened to Daniel?
When?
In chapter 6, what happened to him? Who did he go visit?
The lions.
The lions. He went to go visit some lions.
Oh, yeah.
And how'd that turn out?
Very good.
Very good. The living God actually delivered him. Again, we see a lot of deliverance in the book of Daniel. And who becomes king in chapter 6, verse 28?
It'd be Cyrus next, right?
Yes, it would be Cyrus.
Oh.
And it says, Daniel enjoyed much success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So, now we are on. Any questions about chapter 6? Any questions at all? Okay, now what I did here, this is my lovely, beautiful timeline, is just we learned that the first 6 chapters are in chronological order. We looked at that last week with our time phrases. We don't always know how much time was in between each chapter, and we don't know exactly how long each chapter lasted. We know about how long chapter, what was that, when the tree chapter, that would have been chapter 4. We know that that was at least 8 years. But we don't, because it took a year for him to decide to be prideful again, and then he was in the wilderness as an animal for 7 years. So that was at least 8 years long. But we just don't know how long before and how long after. We just don't know. So, and we know that chapter 3 did take a while, because it would not just be really quick to build that huge statue of gold. It was going to take a while. Alrighty, so chapters 1 through 6 include parts of Daniel's life from age 15 to about 80. And his job seems to be, he interpreted dreams and he interprets visions for the kings. Even though he was put in a really high position, we're never told anything that he actually does in any of those positions. We're never told what he judged over. We never are told kind of his day-to-day life. We're not really told what he does. So, in chapter 7, I got to get there again. Where are we in chapter 7?
Babylon.
Of course we're in Babylon, but who is reigning right now?
Belshazzar.
Belshazzar. And how long had he been reigning?
1.
This was in his first year. So if this is in his first year, where would chapter 7 fit into?
Later. Oh wait, fit into?
Yeah.
To the chapter 5?
Well, in chapter 5 he dies. So where would it need to be?
It's like right before there.
Yeah, so it would be somewhere between chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar's still living, and chapter 5. Would be chapter 7, because by chapter 5 he's dead. So chapter 7 is somewhere between chapter 4 and chapter 5. And it's about, if you want to know years, it's about the year 553 BC. And you can just look on your timeline and see that. So, What happens to Daniel in this chapter? What does he actually have?
He dreams.
Yes, now he's having a dream.
Are you talking about chapter 7? right?
Yes, who had been having dreams?
The kings.
The kings. And now Daniel's actually having a dream. Who interprets that dream?
Daniel.
God.
Look at
Oh,
verse
angel.
16.
Gabriel.
Yeah, an angel. It's just someone standing by in verse 16. Do we know his name? Is his name mentioned in chapter 7?
No.
No, it's not. We don't have a name. So who saw the visions, or who interpreted the visions in chapters 1 through 6?
Daniel.
But who's interpreting chapters now?
Who's interpreting the visions now?
Yeah.
An angel.
Angels are. So there's a big difference, there's a big break between 6 and 7. Because now Daniel's the one dreaming, and angels are the ones who are interpreting. Or what we see as angels are interpreting. So what does Daniel see?
The
Beast.
4 different
Yeah, how many
Lion.
beasts? How
4.
many beasts? 4. What do they represent?
different kingdoms.
The 4 different kingdoms before God's kingdom would have come, which are exactly the same 4 kingdoms. If you go back and your cross-reference would be the statue dream of chapter 2, which if you have your papers from last week is that chiasm that we did. The V thing like this.
Yeah.
The chiasm, because when you look, I actually have one, and Shelley, I forgot to give you
Oh,
one.
yeah, I want one.
But when you look, and we saw that the dream of the 4 earthly kingdoms matches up exactly with the vision of the 4 earthly kingdom and God's kingdom of chapter 7. So it all matches up. And here's your notes, unless we got to apologize. So, the interpretation continues the whole theme about this whole dominion and kingdoms and kings and who's going to be in charge, and kind of really Babylonian history, or at least the Babylonian, now Persian, or now Medo-Persian kingdoms. What's going to happen really to that kind of piece of land? Because now this is the second time that this dream has been given. The first time to Nebuchadnezzar, and now to Daniel, about the kind of order of things of who's going to be in charge of this hunk of land. And then who ultimately is going to be in charge of the whole earth, not just that little piece of land, but of that whole earth. The whole earth. And what's so amazing about this to me is that this land that shows that God is going to be the king over the whole earth, this is not happening in Jerusalem. This is not happening in Israel. This is happening in a foreign pagan country. Where did people always believe that their gods lived?
In their
On the
land.
land.
In their land.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel's God is in a pagan land. And so I think this is also, pardon me, it's really warm. So this is also showing more of God's power, God's sovereignty, the one that God is in control. You know, you're here because I let it happen. Chapter 1, verse 1. I let it happen. These other things from this statue and now these 4 beasts are going to happen because I let it happen. A lot of times, especially in 7 through 12, what we see is the phrase, it was given. Something was given. Something was given. We don't see a lot of it was taken. Or it was conquered. And who did the giving? Yeah, God. Because God is in control of the realms of man, and he bestows it to whomever he chooses. So, how is God described? He's described actually 3 different ways, but in 4 different terms. In chapter 22, how is he described? I'd do good at looking the right chapter, wouldn't I? Chapter 7, verse 22, how is he described?
Ancient of Days.
Yeah, the Ancient of Days, and how else?
Most High.
Yeah, the Most High, or the highest one. Look in verse 25. How is he described in verse 25?
Most High.
Yeah, the Most High, and in 25, and in 27, and in 22, he's also described as what?
Most High.
Yeah, the Most High, or the highest one? Anybody else get anything, or did anything just sort of pop out at them in chapter 7? Or any questions about chapter 7? Alrighty, chapter 8. Now where are we?
Same.
Well, but what's it say?
Third year.
Well, the
Right.
third year.
We're in the 3rd year, so we're now in 550, about 550 BC. So where would chapter 8 come in?
Oh, it has to come in after 5, right?
Yeah, it would, no, not
No,
after 5.
before. So in between there.
Yeah,
right,
so
right.
it's after chapter
Late
7.
4, yeah.
So it's after chapter 7, but still in between chapter 4 and chapter 5, because in chapter 5, Belshazzar's dead. So, and if he's still reigning, well, he's not dead yet. So he's stuck somewhere in there, but 8 does actually follow 7. It's just shoved in between that 4 and 5. Now, can you imagine all this stuff that's already happening to Daniel in chapters 4 and 5, and all of this other stuff? We're not getting a glimpse, not of what Nebuchadnezzar, what's going on with Nebuchadnezzar, because we're not told, but we're getting a good glimpse at what Daniel is up to. So in the midst of these dreams and his regular kind of everyday job that he has to do, he's also having these dreams. This has got to be a real heavy load that he's carrying right now. Because he's not given the authority to interpret his own dreams. So he can interpret the king's dreams, but he constantly says, I don't know what this meant. I'm confused. I'm perplexed. He doesn't know what they mean. So God doesn't give him that authority. And that's got to also be, if me, speaking from a human standpoint, that would be very frustrating to me. It's like, okay, I'm telling him, but nobody's telling me. Or I can't know myself. So angels come to help him, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so in chapter 8, what 2 animals do we actually see in chapter 8? What animals are spoken of?
Ram.
Right.
A ram and a goat. And who does the ram actually represent?
If I remember right, let's see.
Let's see. So the ram had 2 horns, so
It was pushing
Oh,
westward, northward.
it's the Persia and it's the 2.
Yes, Media and Persia. Yes, the 2 horns, Media and Persia. So he represents those 2 kingdoms and the kings of those kingdoms, because now we know that they're co-regents. So who would be the goat?
Rome,
No, not yet. Greece.
Greece.
Greece. The goat and Greece, which for us in English works out really good. Goat, Greece, ram, 2 horns, Media, Persia. So we can kind of get that picture in our head. How was Daniel left after these 2 visions in 7 and 8? How was he kind of left?
He was, shaking, and he laid there for 3 days.
Yeah, it says he was sick. You know, he was exhausted. Then he got up and he went about the king's business, but he was still astounded and there was nobody to explain it to him. So now he had a vision and he didn't know what it means. And it bothered him so bad that he actually just laid in bed for 3 days because he didn't know what to do about it. Then we jump to chapter 9. And what do we see in chapter 9? Does he ever get an answer to his vision in chapter 9?
First of all, now we're in the 1st year of Darius. So
Right, which would be...
Belshazzar is gone.
Right, Belshazzar is gone. We're in about 539 BC. So where would this fit in? Where would chapter 9 fit in then on our timeline?
Chapter
The 5.
In chapter 5 or?
The 1st year was, I don't remember, chapter 6.
Well, it would
I
have
know
to be
Belshazzar died, so-
between 5 and 6 is where it would have to be, because at the end of chapter 5 it said, and Darius the Mede took over.
Right.
So we don't know where in the 1st year it was. It could have been toward the end, the middle, the beginning. We don't know. But we do know that it happened sometime after this is lovely handwriting, after chapter 5, but before chapter 6. Because in chapter 6, we get a whole different king toward the end of chapter 6. Does this chapter ever answer what was going on? No, it really doesn't. As of this point, they've actually been, or Daniel has been in captivity for about 66 years. And what is he now reading? What's he reading?
The Torah.
He's reading Jeremiah. How would he have gotten a copy of the book of Jeremiah? Or did he get a copy of the whole book? Trick question. It wasn't a book.
It was five books.
But it was probably a letter or a portion that he'd gotten there, because Jeremiah was back in the southern kingdom. He was left. He's the weeping prophet who was left.
And was the word taken from them?
The word, was the Torah taken from them? I would have to say yes, because the only copy of the Torah that would have been around would have been in the temple. So they would not have brought it with them, but they had their oral traditions. Because a lot of it at this point was still very oral, and you know, with ideas being exchanged orally, a lot would not have been written down. But
They might have had copies somewhere else.
Well, they didn't have a print machine. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like,
Handwritten.
well, and it could have been something that was written by Jeremiah that he got, that somehow he got a hold of. So what did he find out? What did he figure out? What was about to end for them, finally?
The captivity,
Yeah,
70 years.
he figured out, Jeremiah said, it'll be 70 years. And he's got to be counting down and going, oh my gosh, we've been here about 66 years. We're almost done. We're in the home stretch. And so instead of really celebrating, what are verses, what's really this rest of this chapter? What is it?
Chapter 9.
Yeah, what is it? What does he do?
He's-
Oh, he prays.
He prays.
Yeah.
This whole thing is his prayer. It's all his prayer. And what is he asking God for? What does he pray? He prays really two things.
forgiveness.
Yeah,
Forgiveness of the people.
Yeah, he confesses and asks for forgiveness for not his sins, but for their national sins. And then what else does he ask from God?
mercy
Yeah,
in one spot.
yeah. He asked him for mercy and to please take away your wrath from your people. We're almost there, God. We want to go home. And lo and behold, who shows up in verse 21?
Gabriel, who he had seen before.
Whom he had seen before. So, if he had seen him before, where could he have possibly seen him before? Maybe in chapter 7,
Maybe, but we don't know.
maybe in chapter 8, maybe in both chapters that we're not told the name. But we know that he saw him somewhere, and he had visions in chapter 7 and chapter 8. So we know from somewhere he knew. And how did we know his name? I don't know how Daniel figured it out. But it says, then the man, which actually means like in the likeness of a man, Gabriel, whom I'd seen before, came up in my weariness about the time of the evening offering. And what did good old Gabe reveal to him?
He's going to help him understand.
The visions.
The visions. Because so far, did anybody even explain the vision from chapter 8 to him? No, he still doesn't have a clue about chapter 8 and what that vision meant that made him sick for 3 days. But what does he tell? He tells this is the future of God's people and their return back to the land. It's a very encouraging showing up. And isn't it a comfort that in the middle of his prayer of confession and asking God for mercy and forgiveness, God sends him comfort and encouragement in a very, very tangible way. He showed up. God's messenger showed up and said, look, it's going to be okay. To us, he talks about some kind of crazy time frames because we're talking about 70 weeks and 62 weeks and 70 more weeks and all these other times. And we're like, whoo, okay, that's a lot for our brains to, and we will sort it out, I promise. When we get to chapter 9 in 8 weeks, we will get through that. So the 70 weeks is the time that's decreed for the people and for the city. And we'll unpack that a lot when we study chapter 9 together. So in chapter 10, does anybody have any questions? That doesn't involve the 70 weeks and 62 weeks. Because we'll get into that, I promise. Does anyone have any questions about chapter 9? Any other insights? Anybody find anything very interesting? Or something that just really stood out to you? I know, that's not 62 weeks and 70 weeks. Alrighty, so chapter 10. What's our time phrase for chapter 10, verse 1? What's it say?
Third year Cyrus, king of Persia.
Alrighty, so it's the 3rd year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. It's about 536 BC at this point, which makes it about 2 years after chapter 9. So, where do you all put chapter 10? Because I think it could be like in one of a couple of different places. So where did you put chapter 10? Did anybody put it anywhere? We know it comes after chapter 9, but I think it could go between either chapter 5 and 6, or I think it could go between I was going to say after chapter 6, after chapter 6 and before chapter 7. Somewhere beyond there is where I put it. So we won't be confusing, and I'll just stick it right here, before chapter 6.
You mean before chapter 7?
Yes, I do actually. I mean before, no, after chapter 7, because chapter 7's up here, then chapter 8, then chapter 9 between chapters 5 and 6, but chapter 10 happened just a couple years after chapter 9.
So it's late 5 and 6.
Right, so I don't know if it happened after chapter 6, but before chapter, of course chapter 7 is going backwards in time, so I'm not real sure. But that's kind of where I put it, because Darius the Mede actually, we talked about this, actually ruled at the same time as Cyrus, who was the Persian king. They were co-regents for a while. And we get a really interesting shift in who is talking. In verse 1, who's talking?
Daniel. Yeah.
It says a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belshazzar. They're talking about Daniel. So we don't know who wrote verse 1. We don't know where verse 1 really actually came from. We don't know if verse 1 was maybe put in later by a translator or an interpreter or a scribe to maybe give some clarification, because Daniel didn't, tell where, this kind of happened or what was going on. So maybe a later scribe said, we know when this happened, we can figure this out. So we just don't know. Because look in verse 2, and who's talking?
Daniel.
Daniel. Because he says, I, Daniel. So it's just this neat kind of, shift, and we really aren't given a clue about who actually wrote chapter 10, verse 1. We have no idea. So, what happened to Daniel? What did Daniel have?
A big vision again.
Yeah, a vision, but what was it a vision about, according to verse 1?
Well, they were men and
but it says it was one of great conflict.
Oh,
But-
yeah.
But it says he actually understood the message. And he actually had an understanding of the vision. Because it says that he went into mourning for how long? In verse 2.
3 weeks.
For 3 entire weeks. So 3 full weeks. And that can go over to verse 13 where it talks about 21 days. So for 3 weeks, and we'll unpack that, he didn't eat, he didn't drink, he was very, very distressed. And where did he suddenly find himself? Where was he? Where did he end up on the 24th day of the first month? Where was he?
Side of the river,
Yeah, do you know what, does it say what river it was?
which is Hildekfeld.
Yeah,
Hildekfeld.
which is actually the Tigris River. The Tigris River in Persia. Yeah, that's the Tigris. I'm actually surprised. What version of the Bible do you have? What translation?
It's Thomas's chain reference, so I guess
So no,
it's King James.
because that's actually the Hebrew word for the Tigris River. So that's why I asked, because
I
it
like
was
this
very
book.
yeah, it was very interesting because it did give the that's the Hebrew word for it, for the Tigris River. So yeah, he's standing by the Tigris River, and who talks to him for understanding, to help him to understand?
Well, there was a man clothed in linen.
Yeah.
That's all he says, and fine gold and.
He was dark-skinned, he looked like a lightning, he had eyes that were flames, his hands and his feet looked like bronze, and his words sounded like a tumult, sounded like a trumpet when he talked. So this is a very shiny, very powerful looking, very loud man standing by the Tigris River, and everybody else saw the vision, or he saw the vision.
But they didn't.
They didn't see it, but they were still afraid and they ran away and hid. What in the world did they go hide from if they didn't see the vision?
Or the hear no, see no, speak no evil. They didn't want to see it, but they saw it.
Yeah, but it says they didn't see it. But nevertheless, a great dread fell on them and they ran away to hide themselves.
Or-
Maybe it was Daniel's response.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's funny, when we walk into the jail with our
Mhm.
Bibles, it's interesting, there's a respect. I
Yeah.
noticed that, especially last evening. And so maybe Daniel just had some kind of a spiritual, you know, awakening around him that others could feel
Or fear.
or yeah, enough to not understand, but enough to know that something was going on,
Well, and if his voice sounded like a tumult,
right?
if it was loud, they didn't see the vision, but they could have heard it like thunder. They could have heard the loud noise. They, like you said, they could have seen that Daniel's countenance changed, and for whatever reason, it scared them pretty bad. And you know, we're not told who these men were, but I assume they were at least co-workers, if you want to call them that, of Daniel's. And you know, maybe they understood that he had been so upset and so perplexed for those 3 weeks because he never ate.
Well, and it says he was weak, he retained no strength
Yeah.
upon seeing this, you know, so.
Yeah, I mean, he fell over. And so, yeah, but, I'm sorry. So what was the vision about? What did it concern? Was it what was going to happen, what was happening to them now? Now as in Babylon? What would happen when they went home? Or at some point after that?
It's the days of the future yet.
Yeah, the days of future yet. In your, just sort of your gut instinct, I guess, or maybe you know, has chapter 10 been fulfilled?
Well, is this the one where he talks about there's going to be a savior, and that has been fulfilled?
No, they talk about it. This is the Prince of Persia and the
And
Greek.
this one
and
has not.
Right, no, this one has not. At least not fully. And the two kingdoms again are Persia and Greece. Persia and Greece, Persia and Greece, Persia and Greece. Now what we have to think about is because they're talking about these kind of latter days and these days yet to come, Persia's already there. Greece has not come yet. Greece is kind of next on the statue. Persia's already there. So is this really Persia that he's talking about? Or could it be a picture of something else that was being represented by Persia?
This is Iraq.
Syria, Iraq, Persia. One is Iraq and one is Iran. And Oscar knows, and I always get them mixed up and confused. And I ought to write it down so I don't get confused. But one is Iraq and one is Iran. Persia, and it's out of my head at this point. So it's either one or the other. But who is about to come at this point, according to chapter 20? Who does he say is on his way?
Michael, one of the.
What? No, look at verse 20. What prince is about to come?
Oh,
Who's about to come?
Prince of Persia that he's going to fight with, and the Prince of Greece.
Is about to come. So who's about to take over the land? Greece. If the prince is about to come, Greece is about to take over, or eventually will take over. Or is this an end time prophecy?
And Greece is the goat that
And-
grew the,
Yeah.
had the
Yes.
4 horns and grew the 5th.
And one, yes, and they had the little horn, and I know, this will mess your mind. I know. That's why I have to draw pictures. And I'm not going to show you now because they're really embarrassing, but I will show you when we get to these chapters. I have to draw pictures because I'm a visual learner and I'm a tactile learner. That's why, I color. But I have to keep these things straight. And to keep these things straight, I'm not going to keep them straight just by reading it. My brain doesn't put things together that way. I have a son who does. That's not me. So, my thing is, if you have to draw a picture of a goofy goat and you have to draw a picture of a rat, go right ahead. Whatever gets it in your head so that you can keep it straight, so that you know which one is Iraq and Iran, because obviously I didn't draw a picture of that or I'd remember. But I'm going to find out. So how is Daniel actually described in verse 11?
A man greatly beloved. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, a man greatly beloved. What do some of your other translations have for chapter 11? When it says, "O Daniel, man who's greatly loved, I have a man of high esteem."
Stands upright.
Stands upright. I have desirability, preciousness. What do you have, Marianne? I know you're in King James. What does 11? How does Daniel refer to
And he
it?
said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved, understood the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee I am now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling.
Poor Daniel. He trembles a lot and he falls a lot in these last couple chapters. Poor guy. He's old. He hasn't eaten,
Yeah.
and he's weak, and he just falls down a lot, and he trembles a lot. So beloved, a man of high esteem, a man who's precious, who has high desirability, and who has esteemed him high, who has beloved him, who has deemed him, who's describing him this way. Who told the angel that he was these things?
Well, it's the way I understand it, that was before him in the beginning, which to me sort of, it was that angel that was all girded and.
Right, but who would have told the angel that he was really highly esteemed?
God.
I think God would have told him.
Yeah,
I think
that's-
God, that the message came from God and said, look, so to me that's just more comfort. Hey, you're highly esteemed, you're desirable, you're beloved, by God. This is who you are. So you're going through a really tough time right now. This is hard stuff we're showing you. You don't really understand it, but don't worry. God's with you. God's got you. God's seen everything that you've done during your time here in Babylon, in Persia, or in Mede and Persia. God's seen what you've done. How much do you think God would have to trust Daniel to actually give him these visions?
Completely, fully.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I can't help but think how heavy that would have to be for Daniel. To really kind of know so much about what was going to happen and really be told, now you can't tell anybody.
Well, it says, you go back to chapter 7, verse 15, and he says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, in the midst of my body, and the visions in my head troubled me. I mean, grieved. That's a deep word to me.
Yeah.
You know, it's above just being troubled. It's really deep.
And really, and because he had read Jeremiah, but he knew that they were going home. They were almost done. They were getting ready to go home, but yet these visions were still really worrying him. Because it wasn't when they would go home that these things were going to happen, but it showed yet something else that was going to happen to them. And something else that was going to happen to them. And so, yeah, Daniel's got to go, okay, we're going home in just a few years. But my goodness, after that, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And that would be enough to go, my goodness.
I know, which is, I mean, a blessing that sometimes we don't know what's
That's
gonna
what I was
happen.
gonna say.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I was going to say, it's got mercies.
Yeah,
God's mercy.
exactly.
Because we
'Cause-
can't handle it.
No, because I'm like, God, I don't want to be Daniel. I just really don't want to be Daniel. Just really don't want to be Daniel.
Same thing.
He picked a great Daniel, and it just wasn't me. So, who do we meet in this chapter? We meet a different angel now. Yeah, we meet Michael. And how is Michael described? It's in verse 13 and again in verse 21. How is he described?
Well, he was one of the chief princes. That's what mine says.
Right, the chief prince of what? Of an earthly something?
No.
No, of a heavenly, a spiritual. And then in verse 21,
Yeah.
Michael is referred to as your prince. Your prince. And a prince is not necessarily a royal title.
Well, somewhere, I don't know where, but somewhere it says that Daniel sees the court and the books are open.
Yes,
And wouldn't Michael and,
in chapter 12, yes.
yeah, Gabriel be part of that court? Or did
Yes.
I get that somewhere?
Gabriel and Michael are the only two angels that ever are given names. Heavenly angels. I mean, there's one angel, there's only one satanic demon that's ever given a name, and that's in the New Testament, and that's when he says we are legion. And so that's the only demon that's ever given an actual name. And Michael and Gabriel are the only angels who are ever actually given names. Like we know what their names are.
But
Which
the
is,
chief prince, I mean, that's like an office.
yes. So it seems almost like he would have been above Gabriel. That Michael would have been, because he was the chief. And we're never told what kind of position Gabriel held. I mean, he obviously was esteemed if he's God's messenger to Daniel. So it wasn't like he was bottom of the heap, but by any stretch. But it makes it sound like here, at least in chapter 10, that if you wanted to kind of think of it in a way of hierarchy, that Michael would have been above Gabriel.
Well, it says one of the chief princesses. So it could be,
The same, right, co-leaders, or co-regents, but co-leaders.
Right.
But we're never told. We're never told what position Gabriel holds, ever. I just, in my mind, in my kind of estimation, it has to be some high position because he's the only one with a name. I mean, he's it. So, that's really cool. Did anybody else have anything that they saw that was really, really cool in chapter 10, or any questions about chapter 10? Alrighty, let's look at chapter 11. Where do you think chapter 11 fits in? First of all, it kind of tells us, because we know that this is what?
First year.
Of
Darius.
Of Darius the Mede. Now, if you remember, Darius the Mede and Cyrus did have some time together. And the way I read chapter 11 is that chapter 11 to me is really a continuation of chapter 10. I don't know that there was any kind of, like big division or anything. And what I kind of think, and you guys please feel free to disagree, but in chapter 10 verse 5, it talks about the man dressed in linen. And he told Daniel about this conflict. And then if you look in, and we find out that was probably, the man in linen was probably who? Probably Gabriel, because it says that, and behold, the one who resembled was there, and he had seen him before. So, who was talking to him when he arose? And I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Who is I? Who actually rose to become an encouragement, and who did he become an encouragement for?
Where you at?
Chapter 11, verse 1. See, it says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I
think that's Daniel talking, wouldn't it be?
So who did he rise to be an encouragement for?
Darius the Mede.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Because
Okay.
he had the
That's
truth that had been
Yeah.
revealed to him, is that right?
Who's talking in verse 21 of chapter 10? Who's talking? We find it in verse 16. We know it was who? It was Gabriel.
Oh, okay.
And so if 11 is a continuation of 10, then who would still be talking?
Gabriel.
Gabriel. So if Gabriel arose to be an encouragement and a protection for who?
Daniel.
Would it have been Daniel? Look in verse 21. Gabriel says, however, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. But there's no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael. So, could that him be Michael? Could Gabriel be an encouragement to Michael? Or could Gabriel be talking that he became an encouragement to Daniel?
Or is it both?
Or is it either one? Or is it somebody we haven't figured out yet? I'll just throw that on out there right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I have my opinion, but I mean, it doesn't say for sure, who is what. But we,
The
go ahead.
next verse, and now will I show thee the truth, behold, there shall stand up. So he's still explaining
To,
Daniel.
so if he's talking to Daniel,
Then he's-
why would he say I'm an encouragement
right.
to him instead of I'm an encouragement to you?
Yeah.
So, who could the him be then, if it's not Daniel? I happen to think that it's Michael. And very good observation, by the way, Diana. That was really good. So if he's still talking, and this is just one giant continuation, because of course, there weren't chapters and verses when this was written, I think the him is actually Michael. So we will unfold all of that and unpack it when we start discussing. So, where then would this fit? Where would chapter 11 then fit? If it's a continuation of chapter 10, it kind of has to be, to me, just kind of right there with chapter 10. Because it was pretty much just one giant, telling. Chapter 11 has a lot in it. It has a lot. what countries or kingdoms are actually mentioned?
Persia and Greece, right?
Persia and Greece, and then sort of what other kind of, I guess, areas? Because they don't.
Egypt.
Egypt, which would be the kingdom of the,
North.
no, she's right, south. And then we also see the kingdom of the north. There are some really cool things mentioned in this chapter. In verses 28 through 32, we see the Holy Covenant mentioned. The sanctuary and the temple are mentioned. This abomination of desolation is mentioned in chapter 31. I'm sorry, in verse 31. In verses 16, 41, and 53, reference is made to a beautiful land, a glorious land, or the holy mountain. What do you think the beautiful, glorious land or the holy mountain is a reference about, or a reference to?
Our home.
Our home, which would be in
Heaven.
Israel.
Jerusalem. Not Israel. Remember, Israel is northern kingdom at this point, and it's gone. It belongs to Assyria. So, southern kingdom in Jerusalem.
But
Yes,
the
ma'am.
abomination of desolation
Yes.
is the Antichrist.
The abomination of
temple.
desolation is actually an event.
Yes.
It's not really a person. It just means detestable things that cause people like to be scared, like a lot of horror. So it's actually
Well, that's what they refer to when the Antichrist sits in the temple and
Right.
says, I am God.
right that he causes the abomination of desolation. These horrible, terrible things, or these detestable things that cause everybody to be very horrified.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so the abomination of desolations is actually it just describes the events.
Situation.
Right, it's just
Okay.
these detestable, awful things that in Revelation we know he does while he's in the temple and desecrates it and declares himself to be God, that cause horror. They cause absolute horror to the people. And it should cause horror to the people. So yeah, that is more of an action that the
Okay.
Antichrist does.
Thank you. I
Ooh.
understand that now.
All right. Anybody have any questions? And I'm telling you now, she does chapter 11 in 1 week. We're not going to try to kill ourselves and get through chapter 11 in 1 week. It's not going to happen. We will take it until we can unpack it so that we can all kind of get it in our little human heads. So we will probably take however long it takes for us to really kind of shift this out or sift this out.
I
So,
do have like a little, a question, observation.
Sure.
Somewhere it says that, I guess in the Revelation, that the dead will come to life, that they've been sleeping in the grounds, and some will go up and some will go down. But then you hear that little kid who temporarily dies and goes to heaven and sees his sister, and I just can't grasp that I'm gonna go to the ground and wait.
I have.
We've wrestled with this
Yeah, we
subject.
have wrestled with this. This is,
We won't know until it
yeah,
happens.
and that's just the truth. I mean, we won't, and we have wrestled with this. And unfortunately, there really is no scripture that says when you die, this is what happens. It does say, however, that at the trumpet, the dead in Christ shall rise first. So if they are rising, to me, they haven't risen yet. And it's kind of like in my head, hold on, in my head, I'm gonna let you do your butt, hang on a second. But in my head, it would be almost like you're asleep when you go to surgery. You know, I felt like I was asleep. I've had several surgeries, unfortunately. I had one that was almost 16 hours long. But I woke up and I felt like I'd just fallen asleep, 3 seconds ago. And you wake up and you have no idea how much time lapsed.
Yeah.
I thought it was, an hour or two later. I mean, I had no idea that almost 16 hours had lapsed until my parents were there and said, and I asked how long it took, and they were like 16 hours. And I was like, whoa, what do you mean I was asleep for 16 hours? So it goes like that, and it's just in a twinkling of an eye. So I'm okay going to sleep as long as I know what I'm going to see when I wake up.
Okay, now do I get my turn?
Yes, you get your butt. Go right ahead.
Okay, so here's 4 things that I've balled over. God says he's not the God of dead people, but, people that are alive. Transfiguration, who did you see there? They weren't dead, right? He told the thief, but, the whatever, criminal. Says, today you'll be in paradise with me. And Jesus, he resurrected, but when they wanted to hug him, what did he say? I haven't been to my Father, I haven't risen. So the dead in Christ will rise.
Well, that makes a good point, because actually we couldn't rise until Jesus rose first.
Yeah, that's true. But I'm thinking it's his glorified body, and it could be our glorified bodies that haven't risen yet. Our souls. Because we're going to get a perfected body.
And everybody look like me. Hallelujah.
It's going to be a perfected body, whether it's this feature perfect, or whatever, yeah. So, just like right now, we are really 2 in 1. We're this corruptible body, and we're also spirit. So, what's going to rise?
Yeah,
And we don't know.
we don't know. We don't know. 7 years.
But I
7.5
agree with
years.
that, if once we're dead, it doesn't really matter, because, if he wakes us up later, we won't know, like when we fall asleep and then we wake up, it's
Yep, we don't
Instant.
realize.
I'm worried more about, is it pre-trib or post-trib?
Oh!
Those are the ones that worry me. Am I going to be here through,
Don't worry,
quarters? I
you will-
probably won't.
you will go
That
before the
depends.
7 years.
That depends which one of us you ask.
The Jews, no, unless they're Messianic.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to be.
Oh, so now you agree that the Messianic,
No.
hey, we have it all right? Am I right?
Because I believe we will have to be here for 3.5 years of the tribulation. I believe there's a tribulation and a great tribulation that it's divided by 3.5 and 3.5, that we'll be here for the first 3.5 years. Just like in Goshen, the Israelites had to be, well, they weren't Israelites, but the Hebrew people had to go through
You're talking about 2 different...
would you let
People
you will
groups.
get your butt in a minute. Hold on.
Now, don't filter this.
Because remember, we are in the time of the what? The Gentiles or the
Gentiles.
church. So the church gets taken up, tribulation comes. Sort of like, when Noah went, and when Enoch was taken before,
Yeah.
the flood.
Elijah.
And Enoch is a picture of the church, and Noah is a picture of the Jews. They went through, see, God puts everything
But
in
Noah
nice
wasn't a Jew.
pictures. Well, but he's a Hebrew.
I know he wasn't.
He was part of the ancient tribe.
So it depends which one of us you ask. And this is our dinner conversation. This is why our children need therapy, because this is the stuff we talk about. So now you know the whole truth. So this is, yes, we have very interesting dinner conversations. And our kids just go, when does lacrosse start? So we just like change the subject fast. Or they just roll their eyes at us, which is okay too. All right, so chapter 12. What is the connection between chapter 12 and what we've read thus far? Or what we've talked about thus far? Where does chapter 12 kind of fit into our little timeline?
It doesn't. It goes way into the future.
Well, the things he discusses goes into the future. But when does this happen? Like the actual giving of it happen? Like when now, at that time, Michael, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise.
Probably a continuation.
So I think it is. Because if you look back at chapter 10, it begins with this great vision of conflict. And Daniel is by the river, the Tigris River, and he's talking to a man in linen. In chapter 12, verses 5 through 6, again, he sees the man dressed in linen, and he's talking about someone on the bank of the river. So he was also by the river, the Tigris River, still. And so I think this whole time he's just kind of been by the river. Let's go down to the, so I think that this is just kind of a whole long continuation. So I'm going to kind of undo chapter 10 and put just chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12.
This guy in linen, do you think that's they talk about types and,
Right.
The archetypes, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely, you're absolutely
And
right.
do you think the man in linen is a type of Jesus in that area? I mean, he has the brass legs and urns girded with gold and.
I think it is a good possibility.
Lightning in his voice was like.
And the fire in his eyes.
Uh-huh.
Because these other guys, when they show up, when Michael and Gabriel show up, they're not described that way. And we know that this man in linen is not that. So it could be. It could be a type of Jesus. And there's a word for that. What is that word? That we just learned this too this summer. Jesus before Jesus was born. And there's a word for it, and now that's also flown out of my head, and I should know this because we just spent like 5 weeks talking about it, and I completely...
Like the first Adam.
Well, no, more like when Jesus showed up, they say like the burning bush could have been Jesus. I believe it was a seraph. Yes, thank you. What?
Hold on. What's that fancy word?
He's going to get it. He'll get it. But I think it could be that. I think it could be that. Just like the man walking around in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I think that could have been Jesus too. Jesus before Jesus was born. But yeah, I think that's an absolute possibility. What is that called?
Christophany?
Yes, a Christophany. That would be it. A Christophany.
How do you spell that?
I don't know. How do you spell it, Oscar?
Christoph, I don't know, it just came in my head.
CHRIST, Chris, OPHONY. Like Christ and a symphony. Christophany. A Christophany. And it could be an E instead of a Y. I don't know.
No, you're
I'm a
right.
horrible
This
speller.
was
Like,
something
really bad
else.
speller.
Phony.
So, in verse 1, just in verse...
P-H-A-N-Y.
Oh, Christoph.
Both wrong.
Phony. Not a phony, a phony.
Phony.
In verse 1, just verse 1, there's a phrase that's actually used 3 different times in that one chapter. What phrase is that? It's only 2 letters or 2 words long. And it's
Time.
used. What time?
That time.
That time. That time, Michael the great prince, since there was a nation until that time, and at that time, your people. What time is that time?
That time we were talking about.
The end of the days.
Yeah, I think it goes back to verse 40 of chapter 11 when it says, at the end time, when the king of the south will come and collide with him, and the king of the north, which is Syria, will storm against him. I think that's the time. At that time, when that happens, Michael's about to tell us what's going to happen at that time. That refers back to chapter 11, verse 40. Who is standing guard over Daniel's people?
Michael.
Michael. And over the sons of your people, that's generationally. That means not your people just now, but their sons and their sons, that's generationally. So, is Michael still standing guard over the Jewish people?
Yes.
I absolutely believe it is. I absolutely believe. Because has chapter 12 been fully fulfilled?
No.
No, it hasn't. And so it says at that time, Michael, who stands guard over the sons of your people. So I absolutely believe that Michael, at this very second in time, is standing guard over God's people, over the Hebrew people, the Jewish people. So, how comforting is that not only to Daniel at that time, again, but how comforting that can be to us now? Even though we're not of the Jewish people, we're still adopted and we're still grafted in. So therefore, if we are grafted into God's people, is Michael standing guard over us?
Well, it's comforting, but it's not, because we have people that aren't of following Jesus, and people we love and worry about. So it is, yes, it's comforting, but it's not.
Yeah.
I agree.
Exactly.
I agree. Yeah, I have friends that,
Yeah. I mean,
doesn't matter what you say.
Family, friends, and people out there.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean-
our nation.
Yeah, I was about to say, and our nation. And how, we have meet you at the pole for prayer. And I think
Right.
today, is today the 3rd? Yes, the 3rd was bring your Bible to school.
Mm.
And you know what? I think that's great. I think that's wonderful. But you know what? If I see a Bible in some kid's hand and I know how they live and they don't live according to this, I think that could work both ways.
Yeah.
I think that could work as a turn on, but I think it could also work as a turn off.
That's why there's this thing on Facebook. Do you want the Bible taught in schools?
See?
Depends on who's teaching what.
Exactly, exactly. Now, because I hear that and I'm thinking, my gut reaction is, yeah, of course I do.
Yeah.
But then I think, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Who's going to be teaching and what are they going to be teaching
Yeah.
and what Bible are they going to be teaching?
So you definitely don't want to be taught by the school board.
Yeah, the secular school that
Yeah.
is now.
But as a historical book, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can talk about in the Bible. They don't even want to bring it up because it's religious, freedom of religion, which doesn't
But the
exist.
interpretation, there's too much.
Too much.
Well,
There
but
is
that's what I'm saying. You
chance.
can use
There
it in the
Too much
poetic
is the chance.
and historical aspect without getting into the spiritual aspect, because the Bible
Oh, I didn't
serves
see
a
that.
lot.
As
a lot of
history.
things. Yeah.
I know, but I just think it's so holy that I don't think you can teach it without getting into the
Yeah,
religious. To me, I guess maybe
I couldn't,
because it's-
but I couldn't.
Yeah,
I couldn't go into a
either.
school and teach it any other way than what I'm doing right now. I couldn't, and I'd probably blow people's mind. But but just from going, whoa, But I couldn't go in and teach it any other way. I couldn't go and say, well, this is history, and this fits, Columbus, and this fits that. I couldn't do that. I'd have to say, this is what it is. I mean, if this is God's word, His one word, then, I'm with you. It'd have to be so holy and so revered, and I just don't think it would. I mean, look at it now. It's not even in school, and it's still made fun of. It's still dogged out. I mean, it's still blasphemed, and it's not even taught in school. All right, so we're almost done. There are lots of time references, that are used, but we'll go down through these, and we're not going to discuss them. We got a long time before we get to this. But the first one is in the end time, which is verse 4, 9, and 13. That abomination of desolation is mentioned again in verse 11. Then we get that really fun phrase, time, times, and half a time,
Oh,
3.5
in
years.
verse 7, which
Yeah.
will make you go, whoa.
1 year plus 2 years plus half a year, that's 3.5 years.
yeah, right.
Tribulation verses.
Yeah, for the
Tribulation.
Jews.
And then in verse 11, we also see 1,290 days. But then right in the next verse, it seems contradictory, and we're going to unpack all this, as 1,335 days in verse 12.
How many days is that, 45?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
So, whoa. So in verse 4, what's Daniel told to do with all of this?
Walk
Now
away.
he's been explained everything that his vision, that he envisioned. It took him 3 chapters to explain it to him, but what is he told to do? Is he told to go out and preach it to the people?
No,
Seal it.
seal it
Shut
up,
up. That's what mine says.
Yeah. Seal it up,
seal the book.
shut it up.
So there's more that he knew that we
And-
don't know because he had to seal it up.
Well, but here it is.
But is the explanation here? Is it really?
Oh, okay.
Is the true explanation really here?
Because if it was, we wouldn't have arguments.
We wouldn't have the mystery. I wouldn't get
Well,
pie on
There's
Wednesday.
knowledge there that looks like it's
There is.
not given.
There is. In my estimation of the way kind of things are set up, like in spiritual, there is, I believe, a veil. and we don't see the veil. And behind that veil is the spiritual. And in that spiritual, I believe absolutely there are wars going on. And there are wars going on for the hearts and minds of all of us. And there's a lot of plotting, there's a lot of planning, and it goes on behind that veil that we do not see. And I think a lot of, not just Daniel's prophecies, but I think a lot of the prophecies that talk about end times, that talk about things that will happen that are sealed up, that there's really no explanation given. I think it's because if we knew the explanation, knowing the explanation, look what it did to Daniel. And I think just seeing it, look what it did to Daniel. And so I think if we actually knew what was going on behind that veil, we could not handle it. We would not even be able to deal with it. And so I think we know it's there. We know it's happening. But I think what it was sealed up so that we don't know exactly what all is out there and what is actually on the other side of that veil. Now, we do get to see some in the book of Revelation, what will be happening, on earth and then behind that veil. We do get a glimpse of that with John when he was on the island of Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation. But we don't see that. And that will happen at a time that will be beyond us. Unless God decides, we're going now. But I hate to say it doesn't have to do with us, but it does, but it's in the spiritual.
Do you think our prayers affect what goes on behind the veil?
Absolutely.
I do too.
I do. I absolutely
So
do.
in that regard, it has very much to do with it.
Oh, absolutely, it does. But I mean, what will happen later? We don't need to worry about that because that's not a battle that we have to fight.
Well, yeah, Michael came to Daniel the minute he prayed, but was held up for 21 days.
Right, exactly, because he was fighting
The king of Persia.
the king of Persia. And so, was he really fighting a king? Was that a spiritual thing, or is that an archetype? Is that a type that they were talking about? We're going to unpack all of that. So, and there's 21 days, and how long was Daniel sick and didn't eat?
21 days.
For 21 days. So, is our spirit, we are very spiritual beings, kind of locked in this, kind of crazy body that we end up with. And so I do believe spiritual things do affect us, but nowhere near what's going on in the actual spiritual world, because we wouldn't even know how to deal with that. I believe, if you want to talk about real quick, I'm almost done, the divisions of Daniel, I believe there could be two possibilities, and there's probably 100 possibilities. I think the main one hits between chapter 6 and 7, where in chapters 1 through 6 we see kings dreaming and Daniel interpreting. And then in 7 through 12, we see Daniel dreaming and angels interpreting. And I think it could also, though, go chapters 1 through 5, and then chapter 7 through 8, which is Babylonian kingdom, and then chapter 6, and then chapters 9 through 12, which is the Medo-Persian kingdom, which is reigning. We know this is a historical book. We know it's also a book of prophecy. 1 through 6 is in chronological order, but so is 7 through 12. It just happens to be kind of squished in and kind of put in to chapters 1 through 6. And so that was really why, we did this overview, because when we start to study, especially when we get in, past chapter 4, we have to think this is what we're reading in chapter 4 is happening, but you know what? There's a lot of other stuff going on in Daniel's life. And when we get to chapter, between 5 and 6, there's a lot of other stuff going on in Daniel's life. Besides just what we read in chapters 5 and 6. Because we know in that is also chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. So I think it's really going to help as we kind of unpack things, to just kind of keep that in our head, to look at it. So next week we will begin our unpacking of Daniel chapter 1, which is going to be really interesting. And what I really encourage you to do is, I know we know chapters 1 through 6. We know them, we've heard them in Sunday school, we've studied them, we think we know them. Read them like you've never read them before. Because if you read them like you've never read them before, I promise you, you will see things you've never seen.